Have you noticed something strange lately? You're turning off lights. You unplug appliances, you adjust the thermostat, and somehow, your electric bill is still going up. Month after month. It doesn't make sense, does it? Today, I want to break this down calmly and logically. Because this isn't just about inflation or weather or using too much electricity. There's a deeper structural reason why so many Americans over 30 are feeling squeezed, even when they're doing everything right. Let's start with the obvious. Most people assume their bill is directly tied to how much electricity they use. Use less, pay less. Simple. But that's only partially true. Your power bill is made up of more than just usage. It includes delivery charges, infrastructure costs, regulatory fees, maintenance upgrades, grid modernization programs, and demand balancing costs. Even if your personal consumption drops, many of those charges remain or increase. In other words, you're not just paying for electricity. You're paying to maintain the entire system. And that system is becoming more expensive every year. Across the country, aging infrastructure is being upgraded. Power plants are being retired. New systems are being installed. Transmission lines are being expanded. Smart meters are being deployed. Entire regions are transitioning energy sources. Who pays for that? You do? Utilities pass infrastructure investments directly to consumers. And because electricity is considered an essential service, there's very little competition in most areas. You don't really shop around for power the way you shop for groceries. You're assigned a provider, which means your leverage is limited. Now, layer on something else: demand volatility. Even if you reduce usage, overall grid demand may increase due to electric vehicles, electrified heating systems, data centers, and population growth. When demand spikes, utilities often adjust pricing structures to compensate for stress on the grid. Sometimes that shows up as peak hour rates, sometimes as new line items, sometimes as subtle increases per kilowatt hour. And here's the part that frustrates people the most. You can be more careful than ever and still feel like you're losing ground. Let's talk about blackouts and grid instability for a moment. In recent years, many regions have experienced rolling blackouts during extreme heat or cold. When the grid gets strained, it exposes something important. Centralized systems are fragile. If one major component fails, millions can be affected. When utilities reinforce the grid to prevent future failures, that cost gets distributed across customers. Again, even if your personal habits haven't changed. So the structure works like this. The grid expands, costs increase, rates adjust, bills rise. And because most households are fully dependent on that grid, there's no real alternative built into daily life. Now let me ask you something practical. What would happen if your power went out for 48 hours in winter, or in peak summer heat? No refrigerator, no heating or AC, no Wi-Fi, no charging your phone. For many households, that's not just inconvenient, it's destabilizing. And here's where psychology enters the picture. When you depend entirely on a centralized system, you lose control over both pricing and reliability. That's why rising bills feel worse than just higher expenses. They feel personal. They trigger frustration, even anxiety, because energy isn't optional. You can delay buying a new TV. You can cancel a streaming service, but you can't choose not to power your home. Now let's address something else: efficiency gains. Over the last decade, appliances have become more energy efficient. LED bulbs use less electricity. Smart thermostats optimize heating and cooling. Homes are better insulated. In theory, this should lower bills across the board. But if rates rise faster than efficiency improves, the net result is still a higher bill. Imagine you reduce consumption by 10%, but rates increase by 15%. You still pay more. That's why many families feel confused. They did the responsible thing. They upgraded. They conserved. They adjusted habits. And yet the number at the bottom of the statement keeps climbing. So what's the real issue? It's structural dependency. When your home relies entirely on a centralized grid system, your financial exposure is ongoing and largely uncontrollable. You can manage usage. You cannot control rate decisions. You cannot control infrastructure investments. You cannot control regional demand spikes. You're downstream from every decision made upstream. And for a long time, most people accepted that as normal. But here's what's changing. More Americans are starting to ask a deeper question. What would partial energy independence look like? Not necessarily disconnecting from the grid entirely, not building a massive commercial setup, but reducing dependency, having backup capability, lowering exposure to rate hikes, creating resilience during outages. Because when you shift from total reliance to partial control, something psychological changes. You move from reactive to proactive. You stop hoping the bill will be lower next month and start thinking strategically about how energy enters your home in the first place. And that's the conversation most people never have. We're taught to conserve, we're taught to budget, but we're rarely taught to question the structural model itself. Now, I'm not here to tell you to panic. And I'm not here to sell you something in this video. I want you to understand the system clearly. Your rising bill is not necessarily because you're careless. It's not necessarily because you're wasteful. It's because centralized energy systems are complex, expensive, and constantly evolving. And those costs don't disappear. They get distributed to you. And when outages happen, whether from storms, extreme temperatures, or grid overload, the vulnerability becomes obvious. So the real question isn't, how do I use less electricity? It's, how dependent do I want to be? That's a different conversation, and it's one we're going to explore more deeply on this channel. In upcoming videos, we're going to break down how backup power systems actually work, the difference between traditional generators and alternative systems, why some energy solutions are overpriced or impractical, what realistic home resilience looks like, and how everyday families are reducing both risk and monthly exposure. Because understanding why your bill keeps going up is just step one. Step two is understanding what options exist, and which ones actually make sense for real households. If this topic matters to you, if you're tired of guessing why costs keep rising, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We're building a series that connects all of this logically and step by step. So you're not reacting out of fear. You're making informed decisions. And if you want to go deeper right now, if you're curious about practical ways families are reducing their dependency and lowering exposure to rising energy costs, I've put a resource in the description below. It connects directly to what we discussed today. The structural problem of total grid reliance, and what can be done about it in realistic terms. Take a look after this video. Because once you understand why the system works the way it does, the next logical step is learning what you can do within that system. Subscribe, check the link in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.